I think that some of the topics that I'm seeing right now are related to obviously the telecommunication. I mean, digital infrastructure involves things that we understand is clearly regulated and some that are not as much regulated. Obviously, telecommunications networks and others have become, are very regulated, submarine cables, etc. But what I'm seeing is restrictions on investment, like foreign direct investment, CFIUS in the United States, Team Telecom, which are reviewing transactions, and there's obviously a big trend in these kind of issues with respect to review of foreign investment in every kind of business. And also particularly if you have infrastructure funds or in PE funds, even if they're based in America or based in the EU, they generally have limited partners who may be foreign, and they may trip those reviews. So what I'm seeing is restrictions on inbound investment in the US. Obviously, Europe is catching up, further in Australia, and this is slowing transactions and slowing deployments. Another thing that I'm seeing are sanctions and restrictions, geopolitics. I think it's very important for what I'm seeing right now. China, in particular, it's and capital from China being excluded, equipment from China being excluded, assets. So it's complicated for investors to actually attract capital into their funds to be able to deploy it in markets. Also, I'm seeing potentially inbound or outbound investment restrictions. There's a big talk of reverse CFIUS, or restrictions on investment by the US to other countries, and probably its allies restricting that. So I think those are the issues that I'm seeing right now, particularly, again, restrictions on trade and investment, sanctions, China and Russia being the top, and then potentially outbound restrictions.
Thank you. Philip?
Hi, so I'm Philip Sparopoulos. I'm an attorney or a lawyer, and my background by training, I work with asset managers, so the financial services community, and increasingly working with real economy businesses and particularly in sort of tech and infrastructure on non-financial reporting, looking at the sustainability related metrics and similar that have to be made public. And some of the observations that I've made are that essentially the drivers for change around sustainability are omnidirectional. There's pressure from all directions. So we're going to talk about regulation, but it's customers, it's investors, it's your own workforce, it's the press, it's end consumers, and that pressure isn't something that can be kind of abated in one go. It's not like we've done sustainability and we're finished. It builds over time, and ambitions have to become increasingly credible. So I think that kind of mounting pressure and momentum is something that we've seen more and more and more. The second is that is leading to changes to businesses. So we're seeing new business units. In the past, you might have seen it be, a line item on somebody's appraisal, you will help with sustainability. Then it became a dedicated work stream, then it became a dedicated business unit. And there is this cottage industry, which I am proudly a part of, around sustainability. And I think part of that is because it's not just a case of reporting what already exists, it's about producing new policy, new strategy, and that increasingly becomes board-level strategic decision-making. And then the last bit is really to say that every regulator, every government wants a piece of this, but they're not playing nice. They're all doing their own thing, and at the moment those regulations can be inconsistent, and that poses a real challenge. So a trend that we will hopefully start to see is consolidation and some kind of harmonization of these different initiatives.
Thank you. John?
Thank you, Laura. I'm John Ash. I'm, I think, maybe one of the only operating attorneys. Everybody else is in private practice. So from the perspective of the General Counsel, what we're finding is regulation in two places, primarily energy and land use. So on the energy front, there was a slide up earlier that showed Amazon's 2 development areas in the United States. And both of those are having difficulty just getting power infrastructure online, tremendous difficulty. I think anybody in the Ashburn area knows about Dominion's issues. California, for instance, on the other coast, tremendous timelines to try and improve any type of infrastructure, multiple years, 2 to 5 years sometimes, just to, even on the data center campus, to approve self-generation, for instance, in a limited form. The other thing that we're seeing from a land use perspective is, as Philip said, there's an increasing and kind of a disconnected emphasis on sustainability. And what does it mean? And we're finding it to be very local when it comes to land use, like land is, of course. Each community has its own perspective. Some are finding a conversion from agricultural to the industrial and data center uses. And if anybody's been on a farm in the United States, like I have, you can understand that. It's a way of life, it's a heritage. And those folks are very proud of what they do. And then along with that comes the more the community groups. And trying to read those tea leaves is always a challenge.
Thank you, John. And Tara?
Yes, thank you. So I'm Tara Genta. I'm co-chair of our ESG and human rights practice at the firm. And what I am is a corporate governance lawyer, very similar to what Phil was talking about, is help companies try to understand and integrate this very accelerating risk landscape. You heard one of the observations this morning with some of the statistics that there are two main sources of uncertainties facing the digital infrastructure industry: extreme weather, climate, and geopolitics. And then you also heard a little about the reference to silica. Well, what that references is the fact that over 60%, I think I have the stats right, of silica comes from the Uyghur region in China. And there are trade controls in the US and Europe against the Chinese government because of human rights violations in the Uyghur region in China. So understanding how the geopolitics, and as Phil said, right, that there are different approaches in different jurisdictions, as global, regional, cross-jurisdictional or multi-jurisdictional businesses, how do we understand how those risks present in our industry, in our business, given our footprint, given our supply chain, and how do we accommodate those risks in our own internal programs, diligence and oversight, but also how do we cover for that risk? How do we mitigate? Are we able to cover it with insurance? If we're not, are we able to offload it to another business partner or third party in the supply chain? So that whole risk landscape is, and it's legal, it's regulatory, it's reputational, and trying to understand at the governance and all the way down, companies can understand those risks and address those risks is kind of a ongoing and pivotal area of focus for us and for the digital infrastructure industry writ large. The other dynamic, and one of the reasons I'm here in Europe this week, in addition to being with you today, is to understand how the US landscape is affecting not only the US companies, but companies in Europe and elsewhere. Because not only do we have the ESG risk landscape in the US, we have something called the anti-ESG developments and risk landscape in the United States. And trying to read the tea leaves into how that's going to unfold, what does that mean, and how do you try to accommodate for it, is a challenge. And given the increasing risk and liability to boards of directors, they are taking a much more proactive role in making sure management understands where those, the accountability and the challenges can come from. Because it's no longer just your employees, consumers, civil society advocating for how you're addressing climate risk, climate transition, diversity, equity, inclusion, cybersecurity risks. It's on the flip side of that, holding you to account if you do take proactive steps in some of those areas. And so helping our clients say, okay, what does that mean? So making sure there's a real rigor and how you're setting those priorities, how you're diligencing them, how you're documenting the decision making that you're making and the steps that you're taking to reach those decisions and correlating those risks to operational risk, financial performance, is a way of trying to address that risk, shifting risk landscape. So there's a lot. It's not changing so much the realities of climate risk and climate energy transition, but it is affecting how companies, and I don't know whether you've seen this, but how companies are trying to make sure they're understanding those risks, addressing those risks, and covering for it from a governance standpoint. So I'll stop there.
No, thank you, Tara. If I could go back to Ulysses, my kind of follow-up question is in relation to regulatory frameworks. How do you see regulation evolving in the future? The previous two sessions, for example, focused a lot on data centers. Do you foresee data centers being captured by regulation, for example?
I think yes. It's not going to be regulation by the typical, like the Federal Communications Commission or Ofcom in the UK. I think it's going to be regulation. There's big concerns with data, what is housed in these data centers in particular. I think the Department of Justice has significant concerns with respect to how data is stored and secured in cybersecurity. Departments of Homeland Security as well. So what I would see is significant more regulation in data centers. Not, I mean, from a security and cybersecurity side. I think that's an area that is coming and will go on steroids in the future, and particular and also in other jurisdictions, not only in the United States, but around the globe.
Anybody wants to make any other comments? I'm looking at the panel members because I can see you nodding, so if you want to...
I could definitely add in on that one, I think. I mean, you got the Reagan quote of, you know, if it moves, tax it, if it keeps moving, regulate it. There's an element of that, and I think certainly when it comes to data centers, what we've seen recently is that they have become increasingly visible. I think previously it was kind of an unknown to the regulators. I mean, you could say that already governments don't necessarily understand the tech industry very well, but we literally put on the label of the building its energy capacity. So as that becomes higher on the agenda, clearly that there is a target on our backs, and I think that brings with it a pressure to either move towards sustainability on our own, or if not, then as we are increasingly seeing businesses have to publish things like their Scope 3 carbon emissions, and they're looking at the energy used in data centers, it's becoming increasingly obvious where the high use areas are, and I think that will bring with it a pressure for regulation.
Thank you.
And
please, Sarah. No, please do.
I was just going to add that, and certainly in the United States, what you're seeing is the Biden administration came in with this whole of government approach in terms of regulation, particularly in climate and other areas too, but really focused on climate. And so you're seeing regulatory agencies, for instance, the SEC is taking a real proactive stance, and they have their climate disclosure rulemaking, which now it's gotten delayed, but they think will be out this fall, which is very comprehensive in scopes 1, if it's adopted as proposed, scopes 1, 2, and 3. All of it, depending upon your size in terms of the issuer status, the level of disclosure, whether it has to be independently audited and certified, and even if that is not adopted or issued as proposed, it is reflective of what the investor, the shareholder base, and global regulators are looking at. Look at the CSRD here in Europe, right, and the due diligence directive, which is anticipated shortly. There is this level of disclosure, which is going to then force, in terms of the amount of data and support that you can provide to those disclosures in order to forestall regulatory litigation accountability.
Thank you, Tara. If I may come back to Philip. You mentioned sustainability, given we are on the topic of regulation. Now, sustainability has so far focused mainly on transparency and disclosure requirements. Do you expect that to increase in the future? Do you expect governments and regulators perhaps to be wanting more and to be more interventionist?
Yes. So I think, to go to Tara's point really, if you see what's coming out of Europe, the amount of disclosure that's required, it's not just disclosing facts anymore. It's not just collecting data and disclosing it. It's disclosing things that amount to policy that probably didn't exist before you had to disclose it. So for certain businesses, even just having a net zero policy is brand new. But having internal carbon pricing, that's something most businesses don't have now. So it's essentially saying you have to disclose it, and essentially we want you to write one. We want you to create this for your business. And then once you've published this, once everyone's publishing their carbon emissions, I mean, it's not that far to leap from that to a carbon tax. So actually, I mean, I think no policymakers are talking carbon tax at the moment, but there's a lot in the trade press about it. So you can see how they're building a disclosure framework, but if they don't like what's being disclosed, once they know, once firms have pinned their colours to the mast, it's easy to see how you would create regulation to control parts of that.
Thank you. And John, as the operator representative, given we are again on the regulation theme, what are the legal and regulatory challenges that you or other people similar to you have encountered when it comes to rolling out new infrastructure assets?
I think from an operator perspective, it's the local governments, without a doubt. They're very focused on data center use. When it comes to telecom, fiber optic networks, tremendous, you're seeing a tremendous amount of local government involvement in right-of-way, for instance. I think anybody who's been part of a fiber network understands that right-of-way is maybe the hardest part about building fiber. But in terms of regulating data centers directly, what you're seeing is berming. You're seeing screening data centers. I think Phil kind of hit the head on the nail that they're becoming more out there, more obvious. People know where they are. So it's the local governments, not so much even the state, federal governments that I tend to work with. The local governments, without a doubt, are applying specific architectural requirements to campuses, not just to buildings. And that's where we're finding direct regulation of data centers.
Thank you, Joe. And Tara, you mentioned the anti-ESG movement. Can you briefly tell us what does that mean for basically corporates, regulators, consumers? What are the next steps? How shall we deal with that type of movement?
So just to define kind of what is meant by that, in case you're not familiar, is it's not surprisingly, everything's polarized in the United States, and it is the conservative Republican states and legislators who have decided to stake their kind of political capital in the anti-ESG movement, and it's taken two primary targets, which is climate and energy transition. And not surprisingly, you would see or understand that states like Texas that are very tied to the oil and gas sector is a leading state in terms of anti-ESG, but as well on diversity, equity, and inclusion. So an example of that, it's not limited, but is Florida, with Governor DeSantis and passing laws that are restricting any kind of education discussion that don't say gay bill, that sort of thing. And so you see conservative Republican states, governors, state legislators, state attorneys general, treasurers pulling their pension money out of investment funds, for instance, that have any kind of tie to ESG impact and what have you. You have MAGA Republicans in Congress trying to stop, for instance, the Department of Labor rule that Biden vetoed, but their effort, the rule that says that you may take ESG criteria or considerations into account when making investment decisions for ERISA-backed funds, provided you are fulfilling your duty of care and prudence, meaning in terms of financial performance. So the best thing that companies can do, and that's what I was trying to say, is There's also an increase in shareholder activism, and there have been the universal proxy card rule facilitates a lot more. It makes it easier and cheaper for activists to act in terms of proxies against companies for certain votes. So the best thing you can do is make sure that when you're setting your goals and priorities, that it is done with a real insight, rigor, diligence around those risk areas that relate to your business from an operational financial performance, that if you document it, and that you make sure, supposing you have the policies and the procedures and the governance frameworks and the data, and that's a big challenge, by the way, in the SEC climate disclosure rulemaking, is a lot of companies just don't have the systems yet to be able to pull the data that will be needed in order to back up decisions and representation. So companies are very cautious in terms of what they're saying publicly, not only in their formal filings, which there was always some caution there, but in their sustainability reports and the sustainability parts of their websites, because the SEC's ESG and Climate Task Force is going through those filings and those public statements, and they're going after companies for material misleading statements, fraudulent statements. Vale, a Brazilian mining company, the dam broke. The SEC went after them, and they just settled in March of this year for misrepresentations in their sustainability reports and their SEC filings as to safety, dam safety. And that's under existing SEC rules, not the climate rulemaking, which hasn't been issued yet. So really making sure that you have that rigor in the governance and the documentation of decisions and correlating it to your company's risk and financial performance. That's the key at this point.
Thank you, Tara. Philip, have you seen such an anti-ESG movement in the Europe or the UK? Is it kind of bubbling perhaps behind closed doors?
Not in the same way. I mean, the way that we see this crystallize is that a lot of asset managers are not just European, they're multinational, a lot of them are US headquartered. I think they have a serious problem to contend with because they need to stay, as a firm-wide basis, they need to kind of stay neutral because they want capital from lots of different sources. But within Europe, the pressure is absolutely on going green, and actually almost all of the new funds that we launch now have an element of sustainability built into them. And there's a piece of legislation in the EU called SFDR, which has kind of a Article 8, Article 9 light green, dark green category. And essentially, if any new product doesn't meet one of those categories, it can't raise money. So it's sort of, there is a real polarization, I think. At the same time, you see companies like BlackRock, clearly very prominent US business, that is absolutely activist and is essentially just being beaten up a little bit, but is taking it right now.
Yeah, they're sticking to their guns at least.
Yeah.
I'm just scanning the room. I'm wondering if there are any burning questions from the audience. I can see a hand up there.
Yeah, I do have one. Given the spectrum of taxing Scope 3 emissions, how do you promote a method of offsetting this against clear environmental benefits of digitalisation? I mean, how do we quantify that? Do you think that's a possibility? And that's a big question.
Well, I can try. I mean, I think the reality is lobbying, but I mean, I think if there was a carbon tax that was absolutely flat, that probably will work politically, because I think every country will have its favourite industries that it wants to promote, and it would have to subsidise to compensate. So I think that there has to be a give and take, and there has to be a recognition of the benefits of different different sectors within the economy. So I think it does come back to lobbying, essentially making the case for a sector. I mean, like I say, we're not there yet, but others might have a view about it.
No, the only thing I would add is, at least in the United States, that is Scope 3 is kind of one of the real sticking points of concern with the SEC's rulemaking, because the ability of a company to really document the Scope 3 emissions in their business is a challenge, and that's been a big area of pushback at the SEC. So we don't know whether Scope 3 will stay in the final rule when it's issued, but that is part of the challenge.
Any other burning questions? Okay, I've got one question, or the next question to Ulysses, if I may. You mentioned China in your opening remarks. In your opinion, are all transactions with China now foreclosed, or is this only geopolitics? How shall we go about it?
Well, I mean, just to say, I mean, just to take on a theme that the U.S. is very polarized, and there's one issue, there's one bipartisan issue, is China.
China.
That's the thing. That's one of the few things where Republicans and Democrats see eye to eye, and nobody's able to nobody looks good by being soft on China, to be honest with you. So for the future, I mean, there's still transactions going on. There's still investments in or minority investments for a certain level that can go on with China and in certain industries. But I think the trend is becoming much more complicated, and obviously this is transcending into Europe as well. Germany blocks certain investments in ports, etc. So I think this is going to be very complicated, and we're going to be balkanizing the internet. We may have Eastern networks and Western networks. We may have. It's going to be complicated, and raising money from Asian markets may become very complicated.
Yes.
Yeah, if I could add to what Tara said and Ulysses said about the political climate and how it's affecting China. I live in Montana, in the United States. We've banned TikTok apparently. So it's illegal for me to land in an airport in Montana with TikTok on my phone, at least theoretically. So there's definitely a political issue with China in the United States that's certainly pervading, I think, a lot of legislatures.
Yes, thank you. John, if I may stay with you. I mean, in the previous sessions, we talked a lot about energy consumption. And I was wondering what challenges are being encountered by local electricity grid in getting energy to them, given government and regulatory intervention in this area? It's the review time at the regulatory body. Usually it's a state commission. Just being able to put electrical lines up, distribution lines, transmission lines up, it's just taking a long time. And so when you get a demand at a data center hub like Northern Virginia, for instance, is a great example. I think everybody has heard about those issues. It's taken a long time to get the regulators to approve building those lines so that new power can actually come into those systems and then be distributed. Without a doubt, it's just approving that. Now, Maryland is a little more lighter on their feet, so to speak, than Virginia, is what we've found. They still go back to P&J and the issues that they're having getting enough power to be able to distribute around to the local companies. But it's getting approval for the additional infrastructure. Just hard infrastructure, getting it built is really the long pole in the tent. Thank you. We are almost coming to the end of our session. I'm being shown the watch. So we've got 3 minutes left. So what I'd like to do is, what is your final piece of observation or advice that you would love to leave with our audience today? So if I can start with you, Ulysses, and move down the line.
Sure. I think from my vantage point, I would think that regulation is creeping up on industry or certain parts of the ecosystem that wasn't regulated before. We are seeing significant restrictions on cybersecurity and data. So I think these are areas that we will definitely be be seeing going forward in the future.
I don't want to get in the way of people's lunches. I think for me, it's knowing who within your business is going to be tracking what's coming, because there's an absolute deluge, and it's hard enough for practitioners to keep up with it. So who is responsible for checking what's out there and whether it's relevant? Because country by country across the world, there is so much. So it might be that you rely on friendly neighborhood lawyers, but it might be that you've got someone within your business, but definitely need to have someone.
Very good counsel.
Exactly.
Yes, rely on your attorneys, absolutely. I guess, from my perspective, it's just persistence. Persistence and patience. As Phil said, things are continually popping up, and you've got to meet those challenges, address them, get ready for the next one. And if there isn't a next one, maybe you're not, doing your business quite the way you should. Continue to meet those, I think, and actually seek them in how you operate your business.
Yeah, and it's really kind of very consistent with what my fellow panelists have said, which is that the dynamism of the legal, regulatory, and risk landscape is going to continue and accelerate. So making sure that you understand how those risks present in your business, I endorse what Phil said, definitely who within your business is tasked with really overseeing it. And one of the challenges with these risks is they typically present in different functions and operations of the business. So making sure internally you have all of the stakeholders, whether it's procurement, legal, regulatory, operational for your facilities, that you really are understanding how those risks are arising within your business and how you can really make sure that you're managing those risks, and I would say documenting how you are making those decisions so that if questioned, you have a solid record on which to rely.
Thank you very much. Please take this opportunity to thank the panel.